and one comic book owner was sued for selling Omaha because it was considered to be explicit. This directly led to the formation of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is still running today and protecting freedom of expression through comic books. But it wasn't considered a furry APA at all. So perhaps further on to the furry is in the 1980s at one of the science conventions, Steve Galacki submitted a painting of Irma Fellner, you can see over here, who was an anthropomorphic cat in a science fiction universe. And this character, it started a whole discussion with people that were in attendance about the place of anthropomorphics in science fiction and why someone would like characters like that. And this group then, of course, has also met up at later conventions. So it created maybe the first aspect of the furry fandom. And Irma Fellner was later published in Steve Galacki's Albedo Anthropomorphics APA. So we've got, obviously, there was early this funny animal APA. We've got this discussion about anthropomorphics going on in the comic book fandom. And then, after Footy was discontinued, a year later, Rao Brazil was formed. And this is far more explicitly furry. And later, obviously, it did become started using the term furry. And in terms of furry history, it's often been described as the first sign of the furry fandom. I mean, Fred Patton has said that himself. But he is also a bit biased, as he was for, I think, 16 years the editor of Rao Brazil. So he obviously will want to increase its renown. But Perry Rhodes has said, in contrast, that Rao Brazil was a lot more exclusive than it perhaps should have been. It was only really available to contributors to the magazine, and because of this, it was never able to really represent or lead to the development of anything in the furry fandom. But then, we're still going to just these science fiction conventions, and Rod O'Reilly and Mark Molino. Rod O'Reilly's still quite active. He's running the Infernation blog at the moment. I'm not entirely sure what Mark Molino is doing, but the two of them, they started this room party at a science fiction convention for people who were fans of funny animals. And that was, there were a couple of people who went to that. The next year they decided, okay, it went well, we'll make it an official party. But they handed out flyers that were saying, come to our furry party. And this seems to be the first time that furry was actually used instead of the funny animal terminology. And that, of course, later led to this interest in anthropomorphics being called the furry fandom. Not content with just having a room party, again, Rod O'Reilly and Mark Molino, they started in 1989 Conference Zero, which was really a trial run to see whether they could have a conference just for people who were interested in the furry fandom. And so that was attended by about 65 attendees, and it went on for a while, unfortunately ending with Conference 2003, which is the year it was held, not the number of conferences that had actually occurred. And so there was some discussion about why that ended, but the important thing is now, last month was Anthrocon 2015, which had 6,348 attendees, about 1,500 fursuiters, and a predicted impact on Pittsburgh's economy of $5.7 million. So it's now become a massive thing. I'm sure you know, even here we've got, I think it's 2,100 and something furs for Eurofurence. And these are obviously not the only two. There are multiple conventions all over the world. And it's grown quite a bit. But the 1990s was also the beginning of the internet. Well, not quite the beginning, but we'll say the beginning. And that was when Furry Muck and the user group alt.fan.furry were founded. Furry Muck is, as far as I know, still going and the oldest running muck in the world. So congratulations, furries. In 1992 or so was when the World Wide Web was actually launched. So before that, it was other client services and more text-based internet, really. But as you know, most of us probably found the fandom a little bit after that, or I certainly did anyway. And it started then with sites like VCL, which was launched in 1994, still running, although I'm not sure anyone's actively using it because it has multiple deficiencies. But the main ones that are still going is obviously Yifstar, which was originally done there as the Yiffy Story Archive. Furry Affinity, launched in 2005, which is probably everyone knows about it. I mean, it's the biggest site at the moment. Unfortunately, it has quite a few issues and was recently sold out of the fandom and is now owned by Imbu. And there seems to be some drama regarding the forum as well, but we'll leave that. Later on, due to an expansion in the content that Yifstar was hosting, not just it moved on to art, but also into all levels of content, it was decided to rebrand the site in a totally new direction, and it became SoFurry. A year after that, Green Reaper was not... No, you weren't on it then. You only came later.
I joined at that time, but I wasn't.
Joined at that time. Okay, well, Ink Bunny then started a year later. Now Green Reaper runs it. And the latest one to join is Weasel, which of course, these four are now the main sites that everyone's probably on at least one of those. Is there anyone that isn't on? No, everyone's on at least one of those. So we've seen the furry fandom has grown just from an interest in this anthropomorphics. You know, it's been used as a metaphor, became as funny animals, and now we call it furry. But you want to know exactly what is furry and why is that important? And here I will say a few people have done this before, and there's the risk of course, going into this XKCD situation where instead of reducing the number of terms, you just add one more. It's unfortunate, but it's a risk we're going to have to take. And I'd say the importance of defining furry, there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's nice to be able to say what you're interested in. If you go with this, furry could mean anything, and someone asks you, well, what is furry? And you say, oh, well, I can't really say, it's different for each person. Then it sounds like you're holding a whole convention, you've got this interest, but you can't even say what it is you're interested in, which is a problem. Secondly, if you have a good definition, you can avoid a lot of misinterpretation. So obviously every time the media says something about furries that isn't true, or some aspect is blown out of proportion, everyone goes around there like, no, 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 that's not what furry is actually about. It's not about that, it's not about that. But it's no good just saying it's not something. You want to say this is what it actually is. And that way, if someone gets something wrong, you can say, look, this is really what it's about. It's not all about sex. It's not all about fursuiting, although that's obviously a big part. But the minority of furs have a fursuit. Minority of furs have been to a convention. The majority have some sexual interest in it, but it's not the only reason people are into it. And lastly, it's important that when you're talking about something, you all are speaking about the same thing. So we'll understand English, hopefully, or there's some very confused people in the audience. But to us, then, you say there's a mansion, that's what you see. It's a large house, many rooms, but the word mansion is also moved over into Japan. However, if you've got a mansion in Japan, it's just a regular apartment. It could be only one room. So you'd be quite disappointed if you hear, I've got a mansion waiting for me, and that's what you find. More seriously, if you hear someone's got a gift for you, well, that's great, everyone wants a gift. But in German, gift is poison. So you don't want them to have a gift for you. And that's why I think it's important that if we're also talking about furry, we know, okay, we're all talking about the same thing. Otherwise, if they'd say you argue about something, if one person's talking about one definition, another person's another definition, you could maybe agree, but not realize it, because you're talking about a different furry. And lastly, the word is quite confusing because we apply it to many things. We could say we're all furries because we're the fans, the characters themselves are furry, and you can say the artwork is furry because it's got the characters. So overall, I'd say the most important one here is the characters. They are what everything revolves around. So it's also where I focus most of my attention. So previous definitions, some of them have been good, some of them have been bad. Conference, for example, starts out by saying furry characters aren't necessarily furry. which is great. We know that now. We've got dragons who are furs. We all use it as characters. Actually, I'll come back to dragons later. But we've got, scalies, avians, whatever. They don't have fur, but they're furries. However, they later go on to say, furrydom includes everything from your normal, everyday animals, to aliens from outer space, to vampires and werewolves, to cartoon animals, to mythical beasts and dragons, to anthropomorphic animals. Furry can mean many different things to different people, much like the word fantasy. Which sounds nice, except that is a very, very broad definition of furrydom. So, according to them, all of this is furry. Superman's an alien, he would be furry according to the Eurofurence definition. The snow leopard over here is a normal animal, it would be furry. However, with the more common definition of anthropomorphic animal, we know by definition a normal animal cannot be furry. Dracula is a little bit on the edge there. I don't think many people consider vampires or Dracula furry, but at least he was able to shapeshift into a bat and a wolf, so he's got that going for him. And lastly, the vixen, we'll all say that's furry. Jefferson Zweicafer, he wrote in 1994 that the furry fandom is the organized appreciation and dissemination of art and prose regarding furries, which is alright, perhaps a bit too organized for my taste. But then he went on to say furries were fictional, mammalian anthropomorphic characters. Which obviously, like I said, we've moved beyond that. It's not just mammals. I would say we limit it to just animals though. Some people then would say greater than that is the anthropomorphic fandom. However, it should also be noted, most people that say that in the anthropomorphic fandom, it's just they're trying to distance themselves from any negative connotations of furries. For example, there's an anthropomorphic group on DeviantArt, which I've been following for, a couple of years now. And they obviously have this group favorites that pop up, and I don't think I've seen one of them that isn't a furry character. They're not sharing the brave little toaster or pictures of Ents or something like that. So that one's not quite working either. Then there's this identity thing that often comes up, probably best argued by J.M. Horse, where he called the second wave of furry. And there he draws a distinction between the first furries, which were fans of this medium, and then furry lifestylers, which he said took over. And of course he goes on by saying, now new furries tend to take up an animal persona with a new species and a new name by default. And sure, that is quite common. I'm sure everyone here has a persona. However, that's also pretty much the nature of the internet at the moment. Everyone uses an avatar. And that could be, even for example, the Wii has its own name for its Miis. So this avatar use, not necessarily furry. Secondly, with the identity aspect, you can make it a bit tautological. You don't want to be saying people are furries because they identify as furries. It doesn't make sense. You'd have to say, why are they identifying as furries? What is this common thing that brings them together? Once you've got that, you don't need them to identify. You can just say, okay, they have this interest in whatever, they're furries, even if they want to deny it. It's, you can't deny I'm, let's say a soccer player because you're not in a team. Even if you're kicking the ball around with your friends, that's, well, not a professional soccer player, but you play soccer. Then, slightly with the identity, there's a bit of a risk of conflating furries with therians and otherkin. There's obviously an overlap, and the therians and otherkin are quite involved in the fandom, but it's also not exactly the same thing. And lastly, some artists who are not furry will represent themselves in their work as an anthropomorphic character. With the rise of the brony fandom, they often used original characters to represent themselves as well, as you can see two over there. And some people would obviously say it's furry, some would say not, but it turns out that the Anthropomorphic Research Project interviewed furries at Furry Fiesta 2013, and there are only about 20% of attendees consider themselves bronies. And similarly, in 2014, the State of the Herd, which is a large survey of bronies, also only found about 20% of bronies identifying as furry. So again, subcultures do not overlap completely. And lastly, not everyone has an avatar. For example, Fred, who's been involved for the last 40 years with the furry fandom, he never took a furry personality, and he is definitely a fur. I mean, J.M. Horst did say, we're not kicking people out, he's still considered a fur, but it's a bit condescending the way that you say, okay, we'll let you stay. So I'd say, if having an anthropomorphic character does not automatically make you a fur, and lacking this character doesn't mean you're not a fur, then it doesn't serve as a useful place to pin your definition. And on a slightly less well-known note, because I only saw it on Adjective Species a few weeks ago, Flip had a guest post there where he talked about the modern furry aesthetic. And he says here, the use of anthropomorphism shifted from instinctual and insightful to analogous/referential as a literary device where this paradigm is culturally prominent. Modern furry denotes a subculture where that literary use shifts back. So basically what he said here was any use of furry characters as allegory, for example, Animal Farm, he specifically points out Fritz the cat, or Mouse, would not be furry, simply because they are taking these furry species and using them as a way to represent race or social class or something like that. And I would, of course, completely reject that and say whether it's furry or not would be judged on the content. Judging it on the use, it has multiple problems, not least of it, art is subjective. So I'm not sure if you've seen, it's a really adorable Korean flash animation, There She Is. It's about this anthropomorphic cat, anthropomorphic rabbit falling in love, and the society says no cat-rabbit relationships. Now you could obviously look at that without any sort of interpretation, just say, okay, it's a story about a cat and a rabbit where they're not allowed to be together. Of course, you could also say the cat and the rabbit represent social classes. So for example, like India's caste system, it could be saying, you should get together regardless of your caste. Or it could be about different races. And that, for example, was illegal in South Africa for blacks and whites to marry. I believe also in the US at some point. So maybe they're talking about that. Or maybe it could just be a way of representing homosexuality. Just this relationship that is not socially accepted, but they work through it. And the thing is, unless you know what the author intended, it's very hard to interpret this. And it becomes even more difficult if the work is old. So if we found something that you would say is furry from 200 years ago, you don't know what the political situation was. You don't know if that work was intended to be satire of something. And so it makes it very difficult to then say, this is furry, this is not. So I'd say that's a poor definition. And this is, of course, the one used by Anthrocon, Wikipedia, and I imagine the majority of people, is that furry is just about anthropomorphic characters, which are animal characters with human personalities, characteristics. And for the most part, that works really well. However, there are a couple of limitations which I think need to be expanded upon. And so, if I go to my definition, I'd first say that furry is a mixture of human and animal characteristics. And these pictures over here, which I believe are all by furry artists, come from the werewolf calendar. And the thing here is werewolves are not anthropomorphic wolves. They are humans that have transformed into a wolf through some various means. So what you have here is not furry, either a wolf or a human, and through some process, either anthropomorphism or zoomorphism, you get a combination, either an anthropomorphic wolf or a werewolf. And depending on your interpretation of werewolf, they can be indistinguishable from one another. But the starting points and the paths they took to get there are different. Furthermore, I'm glad to see we've got a fursuiter here. The fursuit character is certainly furry, but underneath that we know there's a human. And it wasn't the character, in this point the human putting on the suit is taking on animal characteristics to become furry. And so fursuiting is pretty much a furry specific thing. I mean, you have mascots, but it's not really the same thing. It's certainly not personal characters. And I'd say you wouldn't really want your definition of furry to exclude fursuiters from this mix. So either way, as long as you're mixing the two characters, then I'd say it's furry. The second point, I would say furry requires a non-anthropomorphic starting point. Because certainly if you're going with the original definition, it's an anthropomorphic whatever. If that something is already anthropomorphic, you can't add to it. For example, if you've got a fox, you can give it human arms and legs. If you've got a chimpanzee, it just doesn't work. But you don't consider a chimpanzee to be anthropomorphic just because it's got arms and legs. That's how it is. So this is a Pokemon character, Lucario, which is inspired by a jackal, but it's not just an anthropomorphic jackal. And it's also not something that you can anthropomorphize much further. In one of the Pokemon movies, it was shown to be highly intelligent already, although I don't believe it could actually talk. But its body shape is human, so there's not much you can do. So I wouldn't say it's actually furry. That's different for some other Pokemon. So Pikachu or Growlithe can both be made furry, quite simply, just like a normal animal. And maybe a bone of contention is dragons. You have a certain similar issue with dragons are not real, so you'll have many interpretations of what dragons are like. For example, Chinese dragons, you've got European dragons, and you've got more modern ones such as Toothless, who's highly intelligent but can't talk, or Smaug from The Hobbit, who's highly intelligent and can speak. Incidentally, J.R.R. Tolkien, who's often just considered to be a UK author, was born in Bloemfontein in South Africa. So it's just something to keep in mind, so it's not stolen away and considered to be a UK thing. But with dragons not being real, you don't have a non-anthropomorphic form. Toothless is the canon non-anthropomorphic form for the How to Train Your Dragon universe. So in that case, I would consider dragons to be furry related rather than true furry, which of course might upset some people, but I want to make a few points there. Firstly, because I'm not considering identity to be a criteria for furry, that doesn't mean anyone with a dragon persona is not furry. The character is separate from if someone is furry. And secondly, things like dragons, Pokemon, Therians are obviously very much furry related, and so they would certainly surround furry, obviously welcome in the furry community. And, you know, the borders between what is furry related, and what's not furry are porous. That's why I've got them as dots here. Even if you go to animals, most furries have an affinity towards animals. Most furry artists draw non-anthropomorphic animals. It's a big thing. Some people might say, and of course they have told me before, that it's too much shades of grey, you know, it's a continuum, and that's true. You might even take, and there was another essay on adjective species about post-furry, which happened to be these, let's say a vixen that was actually a lava lamp as well. So, you know, it's sort of strange thing like that, but you'd say there, is it really, question?
You have Lion King in the furry section, but
yes.
Yeah, you're talking about human traits in animals, and the only thing I can see then is like talking.
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, if you take the 90-something Robin Hood movie, those wore clothes and walked into furry feet and all.
Because anthropomorphism doesn't have to be just physical anthropomorphism. So I include there the mental anthropomorphism of giving them a higher intelligence, giving them the ability to speak. And so that's what I include. I mean, you could perhaps argue that it should just be physical, but yeah, I've been told, because my character is a normal Growlithe, but with obviously normal human intelligence and speaking ability, that I'm not a furry because I didn't have a physically anthropomorphic character. And Fred, for example, has also been told, because he doesn't have a persona, he's not a furry either. And I'd say none of that matters, partly on the identity and partly because your human traits are also intelligence and speaking. In fact, intelligence is perhaps the most important human trait. So, it's arguable anyway. So the overlap, and on that continuum idea, you get, for example, the color spectrum. It flows from one color into another, but we don't struggle to say, okay, there's actually red, blue, green, yellow. Even though at the borders between them, it'll blur, and people might have different ideas which color, is it actually yellow or is it green? But we can recognize certainly in the center that there are defined regions that are green, blue, or red, unless you're colorblind. And lastly, which I'm sure everyone gets, they've probably seen these pictures before as well, is that the furry form should be significantly different from the canon or the real form. Mostly because if you're looking at an anthropomorphic wolf, you've got a human on the one end, which is not furry, a pure wolf on the other end, also not furry, and in between you'll have any sort of combination of them which could be furry. It's quite difficult to say exactly what point it's furry, but we don't usually draw characters that much on a continuum. It's usually some fixed point. So it's either the ears and the tail, like in the Japanese neko pictures, or sometimes you get them, these semi-anthro, so 4 on that scale, and a Riki Fox has drawn a couple like that, I think it was. But most of them, furry characters, are pretty much about the same level of furry. So to me, that makes furry describing a character possessed of a combination of human and animal traits in such a way that it's significantly different from the real or canon form. Again, it's quite similar to the standard definition, but with a couple of changes that I think are important to be, in some cases, more inclusive, in some cases, slightly less, but with the different layers of true furry, semi-furry, I think it covers that fairly well. That, of course, gives you the rest of the definitions. Fans are obviously people that are fans of those characters, or perhaps some of the related ones. And the artwork is artwork containing those characters. But here is where I want to also bring up furry music, mostly because it's annoyed me a bit, because the way they use furry music is often quite different to the way you'd say furry artwork. So obviously, there we go, furry artwork about music. But, this is just a term taken from Wikifur. Furry music is a term that is often used to describe music of any particular genre that is either performed by self-described members of the furry fandom or centered around the themes of a furry nature, or both. And the centered around themes of a furry nature is how we would usually describe something as furry. But if you look at these pictures, all by furry artists, and I must admit they do have some relationship to the furry fandom. I'm not going to tell you exactly what, but maybe you know some of them. These we probably wouldn't say are furry pictures. I mean, I'd certainly be disappointed if I went to the art gallery now and all the pictures were landscapes or, the interior of rooms just drawn by furry artists. And yet, we're quite happy, well, I'm not happy about it, but some people are quite happy to say just instrumentals wind up being furry music. And I'll use Foxamore as an example because he does some that are considered furry music, some that's not, and he's not likely to, he's big and famous enough not to care if I say anything bad about him. But a lot of his work, at least in the earlier stages, I'm not sure so much now, was instrumental. There was no furriness to it. I mean, there could have been a theme that it wanted to imply something about the furry nature, but if I painted a red canvas and said it's a representation of the rage a bull feels when it's about to charge, you probably wouldn't say it's a furry picture. It's got that sort of link, but it's just not strong enough. And as another example, if we look at this, it's a scientific paper, Phenol propanamide derivatives as inhibitors of hepatitis B virus replication. Who would consider that to be furry? No one. However, if you notice, the second author is Samuel Conway, the chairman of Anthrocon. So if just doing an instrumental music thing is enough to make it furry because you're a furry, then surely him writing a scientific paper should be furry because he's a furry. And if it's not, you need to wonder, why is it not? How come for music we're also allowing performed by self-described members of the furry fandom? That opens it up to all sorts of complications. So performed is different to written. If a furry sings a song off the radio, does that song become furry? Just for maybe that performance only? And you also got to wonder, is the way they cook furry cooking? Do you do furry commuting or furry cleaning of your house? It doesn't make sense. You need to say it's furry because it's got some context. So I'm not sure if you saw that all the Single Furries music video, which was done. They changed the lyrics, which made it furry. The music video, obviously with fursuits, was furry. Foxamore was involved in that, so he's back on his furry music thing. And there's been many other music videos as well, which you can say are furry, because they've brought some aspect of the furry fandom to it. If you're saying it's only furry because someone who does it is a fur, then you also wonder what happens if they leave the fandom, if they lose their interest. Does that song stay furry because they made it when they were a fur? Does it no longer become furry? Or is it furry when they originally did it, but no longer furry? In this point, I would go with Nice, the singing dog, who has said, for me personally, if we can properly define furry music as being furry music, I believe that kind of music must contain lyrics and a story about anthropomorphic characters, or contain language that emphasizes with the furry community. So, for example, Come See Fox's The Wolf in Me, or The Wolf in You, or something like that. That, I would say, is definitely furry music. However, Foxamore and Coulson did a really beautiful cover of Hallelujah, but I would not consider it to be furry music. So, in conclusion, furry has been, in some form, a part of human culture for thousands of years. And it's great that it's now becoming its own separate entity. However, it's only been around like 30, 40 years, and I think with some of these definitions, they're either not completely clear or they're not used consistently, and I think the fandom still has ways to grow. I mean, my definition, for example, obviously I personally think it's better than the current ones, but I don't think it's perfect. I know there are a lot of places where it just does not work, and at the moment I don't know a way to fix it, but I still prefer it over other ones. And so the last point I just want to leave, when you're thinking about what is furry, I think it's also helpful to ask, what can you change about that to make it no longer furry? So if you see a picture and you say, is it furry? You can say, yes, there's an anthropomorphic character in it, and if I took that away, it would no longer be a furry picture. But if you're saying, you know, this music is furry because somebody wrote it and they're a furry, there's nothing about the music that you can change that would stop it from being furry. And I think in those situations, it might be the case that you are trying too hard to make something furry, and it shouldn't actually be considered furry. Yes, so thank you for listening, and hopefully it was interesting and entertaining. If anyone has any questions, discussions, wants to say I'm an idiot, it's all happened online already, don't worry. Yeah.
So I think one of the issues you might face is that, go back to your examples of Mouse, for example, the author didn't necessarily intend it to be about, like, what I would call the furry condition. Yeah. The fact that they are anthropomorphic characters is purely an artistic device to distinguish them, rather than being about the fact that they are human, they're not human and they're not animal.
But I mean, that, I would say, goes to, was it Flip's definition about you needing to have this certain intention and, whether it's used as a metaphor or not. And I'd say it doesn't really matter if you intend it as something furry. I mean, for example, the Disney movies, like Robin Hood, wasn't intended for the furry fandom. But I would still say it's furry because I would judge it based on the content of whatever it is. Yes?
Your thoughts on Zootopia?
Well, I've seen a lot of people saying it's been aimed at furries. I would say it's certainly furry in terms of content. I wouldn't say it was necessarily made by furries or for the furry fandom. But, you know, like other movies like it, it's furry by content. Yeah.
Well, your definition is quite reasonable in there, but I think most of the definitions tend to focus maybe a bit too much only on the form. This, the psychological aspect of the character, I think, is actually important in terms of where it starts apart from the rest. I don't think it fully makes sense to consider, for example, Bugs Bunny a true furry. Or funny animals are pretty easy to distinguish from furries, even without the working definition. I think that's the weak spot of the definition of furry rollers, for example, that absolutely wants furries and funny animals to be considered part of the same thing.
Yeah.
But if you compare Bugs Bunny to Lola Bunny is certainly much more similar to typical furry characters than Bugs Bunny is. So I think there is some other criteria for that to be covered, I guess. I don't know if something which has to do with sexualization or with the characters being more aware of their status or something like that. Something yet to be discovered, but I think there is a need to be a bit more precise.
I haven't heard people saying it should be more precise and cutting out more things. That's a first, but
not many things, but
yeah, I would say also remember, because furry was coming from this funny animal fandom as well. So there's certainly, for a long time, we're running in parallel and were the same thing. We might have now moved so that furry is perhaps separate from how people are using funny animals, and perhaps that was the topic of the talk I couldn't go to yesterday. But I personally wouldn't be supporting excluding funny animals.
But if you look at the running fandom, it's the funny animals which are truly established from furry, so there must be something that
It would need, I suppose, more discussion maybe, but yeah.
Just an addendum, the problem here is furry is not a genre.
Yeah.
Yeah, meta-genre. Star Wars, not furry.
Yeah.
Chewbacca, Ewoks, furry.
Well, I'd say they fall under alien with no non-anthropomorphic forms.
Yeah, I was going more about the genre here.
Yeah.
Because we are encompassing so much, it's really hard to differentiate if funny animals are in it or not.
Yeah, obviously it does. It's more like, comedy, I suppose, would be a similar thing. You can have comedies with all sorts of other characters, all sorts of other themes. It's not one specific thing. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Would you say that, especially when it comes to music, would you actually say that it's more the intent of being furry than anything else? As in, someone could draw an anthro wolf, and could that be considered non-furry if there was no intent for it to be furry?
Now, I would judge it purely on the content, not the intention. So I would also say people that haven't heard of the furry fandom but have that interest, I would still consider them to be furries, even if they don't yet know about it. And so that's where, for example, this identification thing would differ. Would say, unless they know about the furry fandom and actually say they're furry, they're not furry. But to me, again, it's a separate thing from whether you identify it. It's like if you're blonde or something, you're blonde, whether you identify as blonde or not. I mean, you could dye your hair, but although your hair does change, but so does your interest in furry. So. Yeah.
And intentions are really hard to read.
Yeah, that is true as well.
There was I read somewhere, Heinlein visited the school where they read a book of his. And the teacher came to the conclusion what the book was telling. What Arthur wanted to tell. And Heinlein said, that is not what I wanted to tell.
Yeah.
So intention is difficult.
I think there was somebody who sent, I heard something about it, they'd send letters to a number of authors whose work was, obviously criticized by all these literary people, and they bring these metaphors in, like, this character did this because it represents that, and it's like, is this what you intended? And majority of those is like, no, I didn't mean that. They just, want to interpret something and they read in their own thing, which is obviously a good thing about art. You can read whatever you want into it, but it also means, that's not necessarily true. I do wonder, in English classes, how much of that is metaphor, how much is just chance. Yeah.
Yeah, but what about classifying other people as furries? As example, the creator of this Furry for Kids club distincts himself from furry. He says he's not furry, but he definitely wears a fursuit and also enjoys furry art.
Well, I'll go there. The fursuit not necessarily making furry. It would be if you have that interest, and perhaps it would be good to say a preference for anthropomorphic characters, let's say, or furry characters, then that would mean you're a furry. I mean, regardless of whether you want to call yourself that or not. Like I said, there are many people that I think are furry, and the only reason they don't use the term is because they don't want to be attached to any baggage or drama that might come with it. Okay. But he's got one in the corner.
So, when you say that even if the author has stated, like in the example of Dukai, for example, the word comic, where 2/3 of the cast are anthropomorphic, would you say that's a furry comic, even though the author, Tom Fishback, has stated that it's not a furry comic, it's just a fantasy setting with animals?
Yes, I'd say it's still furry. I mean, if George Lucas came and said Star Wars is not science fiction, it's just set in space, and in the past, that's the future, and no one's going to take it seriously. It's science fiction because of what the content is about, not whether he actually calls it that himself. I mean, that's just someone being in denial. There was another question?
Now regarding furry identity, I heard from multiple sources that, for example, Japanese furries usually don't have a persona or don't try to identify themselves with the characters. They usually create characters, but it's much more rare for them to identify with the character. So
it's just good to know.
In fact, I created all that's why the process definition sounds doesn't really work. Exclude all the Japanese words.
I mean, there is, I know it's come up before, the Asian, as far as the Asian, basically, furry community is not exactly the same in terms of the structure, and I think partly because of the language difference, there's not too much overlap. I mean, you do find like Japanese artists, or I watch on Inkbunny, there's from Thailand, I think. What's his name now? I can't remember at the moment, but so you do get some Asian furries involved in, for example, the Western culture, but I think for the most part they're being separate. So if we talk about furry, we don't have that experience. And it would be good to know, but it's hard with a huge language gap.
Yeah.
Oh.
So if we're going to judge more on appearance than intent, where does that leave mascots? Some of them have clearly very anthropomorphic characteristics, but in the nature of the dog, we consider themselves furry, and others who, more for example, dragons may be borrowing elements from non-existent creatures and combining them to get their character, while still not considering that furry.
The mascot one's probably a good point. I could say that some of the characters are certainly would be furry, even if it's not for the furry fandom. I mean, like I said, with the dragons, I'd put this difference between, furry, as in fitting this sort of mixture of human and animal, and this having a non-anthropomorphic starting point, and then this furry-related, which I would, for example, that's my character basically, that someone drew for me from South Africa, and it's, for example, a Pokemon, and I still would not consider Pokemon itself to be furry, but I would still consider myself to be furry. And certainly Pokemon are quite prevalent in the furry fandom. And it's the same thing, I wouldn't also consider My Little Pony to be furry, although I still have an interest in that, and I think it's still important as part of the furry community, which I think can extend a bit further than maybe you might want to define the words. Yeah?
opinion on the mascots. I'd say the suits or the costumes would be furry, but it wouldn't be that because they don't do it for their preference for it, but simply to stand out as a mark.
Yeah, certainly the people under the costume are not furry. I mean, maybe some of them are, but the majority just do it because it's what they do.
I was curious about your assertion that My Little Pony isn't furry. I mean, it's like, are you then not judging it on the content? Because clearly there are animals, but they have human characteristics.
See, My Little Pony is one where I think my definition doesn't work very well. Mostly because, for example, unicorns, alicorns, pegasi, none of them are real. So, strictly going by my definition, they're not furry. The normal ponies are furry, would be furry because they are real. So that's actually the main point where I know it breaks down, because you'd have different characters that are quite similar from the same show, but would be sort of termed differently.
So I'm looking at my character, and actually we had trouble defining it, what categorization it was on Wikipedia, and we had to decide it was an alien character. It was from another planet, it was not real, so that's not furry. Under your definition. That's going to be fun. Okay, we'll have to take that.
Because there's no, you've got no combination of a non-anthropomorphic norm. It's sad, but somewhere you've got to draw a line anyway. It just depends where it will be. And I mean, I think that one best keeps, if you're going from the most common one, the anthropomorphic whatever, you keep that part of it. Because otherwise, again, even if you've got a norn, you've got a dragon, they're not an anthropomorphic dragon, because there isn't a non-anthropomorphic dragon. At least that's the way I see it. Some people disagree, some quite a lot. Yeah. Any last ones? Okay. Thank you. It was fun.